Well, hello, it's me, your local neighborhood Sophia. How are you doing today? Hopefully, you're doing very well. I'm doing just peachy keen. Thank you for asking. I killed the Godskin peoples, and now we're just in like what looks like a Welsh village that is not very well taken care of and very foggy. And I'm pretty okay with that. So, I've been reading a lot of Ramakrishna and Sarada Devi's quotes lately, and I've been thinking about them. And I've also been thinking about like war and the nature of suffering and a variety of other things. And I thought this might be an interesting place to start with a little video. And I wanted to read to you this exchange between the Holy Mother, Sarada Devi, and one of her disciples. And I thought it was kind of an interesting little tidbit here. The mother was engaged in a conversation with me this morning. Disciple. Mother, if there exists some being called God, why is there so much suffering and misery in the world? Does he not see it? Has he no power to remove it? Has he not the power to remove it? Mother, the gracious self is full of misery and happiness. Could anyone appreciate happiness if misery did not exist? Besides, how is it possible for all persons to be happy? Sita once said to Rama, why don't you remove the suffering and unhappiness of all your subjects? Please make all inhabitants of your kingdom happy. If if you only will, you can easily do it. Rama said, is it ever possible for all persons to be happy at the same time? Why not? Asked Sita. Please supply from your royal treasury the means of satisfying everyone's wants. All right, said Rama. Your will shall be carried out. Rama sent for Lakshmana and said to him, go and notify everyone in my empire that whatever he wants he may get from the royal treasury. At this, the subjects of Rama came to the palace and told their wants. The royal treasury began to flow without stint. When everyone was spending his days joyously through the Maya of Rama, the roof of the building in which Rama and Sita lived started to leak. Workmen were sent for to repair the building. But where were workmen to be had? There was not a laborer in the kingdom. In the absence of masons, carpenters, and artisans, all buildings went out of repair, and work was at standstill. The subjects of Rama informed the king of their difficulties, finding no other help. Sita said to Rama, it is no longer possible to bear the discomfort of the leaking roof. Please arrange things to be the way they were before. Then all will be able to produce workmen. Now I realize that it is not possible for all persons to be happy at the same time. Let it be so, said Rama. Instantaneously, all things were as they were before, and workmen could once more be engaged. Sita said to Rama, Lord, this creation is your wonderful sport. No one can suffer for all the time. No one can spend all their days on this earth, in suffering. Every action brings its own result and gets one's opportunities accordingly. Disciple, is everything then due to karma? If not, to what else? Then my mother said, if not, to what else? Don't you see the scavenger carrying the tub on his head? It's kind of interesting. So, on some level, this is an interesting take because, in truth, how can everyone be happy? By the very nature of existence, there is such a thing as entropy, right? And there are things that go out of place. Now, one could question, why has God made the nature of existence entropy? Is it that it's all just for sport? Is it that things are meant to pass, or why? And I think it's very interesting to think about like the implications of stuff like this. Because I think on one level, there's actually a very simple answer, which is this is not the end point. Even heaven is not the end point. The end point is eventual reunification with God. The end point is for each of us to rejoin God as we once were. You know, if we all come from God and we all are part of God and, you know, the whole universe is God, then would it not make sense to rejoin the pure consciousness that we started from? A bit of suffering also makes it so that one can truly appreciate the pleasures of the world. Anyone who's had a life where you've had like long strings of just doing the same pleasure over and over again will quickly learn that, you know, it's very good, and it gives us a lot of meaning to step away from that and to have different moments, right? To have different things, you know, leading us in life, and different things to give us meaning. We'll find that if we constantly just do the same thing over and over again, it's difficult for it not to become repetitive. And if the universe is in some sense meant for sport, meant not just for our own um, unification and justification and return to God, but is also meant for this greater journey and this change to be wrought upon us, and for all these different little things, then yeah, you can't make a universe where everything is perfect. Like, you'll notice if you especially pay attention to a lot of like Hindu or Buddhist cosmology, or even Jain cosmology, there's kind of this idea that heaven is nice for a while, but heaven is not a place of change. Heaven is a place where you enjoy your pleasures and you run around to your thing, and then you're reborn to start a new life over, right? If that is the case, then heaven is not really meant to be a place where you learn and grow. Heaven is meant to be a place where you kind of enjoy yourself. And that's fine. And, you know, not every moment has to be full of profound change. Some moments can simply be for you to enjoy yourself, right? But the implication here is that for change to truly take place, and for humans to really develop and change, there needs to be basically at least a little bit of chaos. There needs to be a little bit of chaos within their lives. Everything needs to be able to kind of switching back and forth. If everything is perfectly pleasant, then there is no motivation to change. If everything is perfectly miserable, then there's also no motivation to change, but simply because one becomes beaten down with the reality of their life around them. There's also a lot of other little thoughts that go into this, like how negative is any of this suffering really? If it's all temporary, and if it actually has the ability to give us, you know, lessons, and the ability for us to maneuver and grow. If we all have this ability to maneuver and grow, and if all this suffering is temporary, how bad is it truly? And that's another thing. If all suffering, even like death and, you know, famine and all these other things, like, like death being like this sort of thing that we view as an endpoint, but if it's not actually an endpoint, then, you know, there's kind of the question of how bad is it truly. And if all suffering is ultimately an appearance, right? Like, if all suffering is merely like something that appears to us on this sort of surface level of our consciousness, but is not something that we necessarily have to directly experience, then how bad is it really? And it's very interesting to think about all this stuff, because, you know, what is the point of suffering? What is the point of existing within these realms? And better yet, what answer would truly be satisfying for us to behold? If the answer given to us, and there's a lot of answers I've heard. Some focus on the cause of suffering, others focus on the remedy towards suffering. Some focus on, like, the idea of what is suffering really, and how much of it is simply in our control, even though we would act like it wasn't. And how much of it is also, you know, like a call for us to embrace the will of God and to embrace... I really like this outfit. And how much of it, for instance, like, if you suffer and you go back to God and you find peace in God, and if you suffer and then you find that that drives you to truly seek peace and a greater deal of happiness, excuse me, yawn there, then how bad is it truly? And, you know, there's some stuff where it's like, well, karma is, like, if you start talking about karma as the reason we suffer, or the reason that there's any suffering at all, you know, I think that honestly begs more questions than it gives answers, in a sense. But, I mean, you can still find answers if you investigate what various different religious texts and people have said throughout time about, like, the nature of suffering and, like, the nature of... Thank you for the rat ashes. And also the nature of rebirth. It's kind of interesting, too, because if you ever read the Bible in terms of its... Oops. There we go. If you've ever read the Bible in terms of why it says we suffer and, like, all the various different reasons, you'll find that something kind of interesting there is that it doesn't actually just give one answer, it gives a multitude of answers. And it kind of depends, like, what chapter you're in and, like, what you're reading and what part of the Bible you're reading. And that'll also give you various different answers. And it's also true of, like, Hindu philosophy and theology to a certain extent. Often the reason we're given to suffer is said to be, or, like, you know, especially in, like, Buddhism and things like that, is said to be that we cling to things, and things are always, like, changing. So if you cling to things and you want them to stay a certain way, but they're always going to be changing, then of course you're going to suffer. Because if you're always on your way trying to if you're always clinging to something and everything's always changing, then that clinging is going to cause you to suffer. Like, there is nothing that is eternal, you know, except for, like, God and the nature of the cycle God has created. Although Buddhists probably wouldn't say, like, God, but, you know. Everything is always changing. There is no, like, permanent anything really, or permanent self, or anything like that. So like the nature of things is that they are always changing, and that there's always something new going on, and that our desires can never truly be met, like on their base form, because you know, like even if you examine your own desires are always changing, and by the very nature of wanting and like being a human being, or just being a creature of any sort that wants, there cannot be a final desire for you. There's only the constant changing desires that flow through all of existence. And it's like, well, okay, that's pretty interesting, because in a lot of cases you'd have to ask, well, if God has decided to set up the universe in this way, why? And you could give a lot of different answers to that. One answer could be as simple as, well, if the reason we're here on some level is to participate in the Leela, to participate in the play of God, and it's to foster change and to foster understanding and all these things like that, and for us to reunite with God, one would have to ask, well, what would even be a better way of doing that? Wouldn't the best way of doing that simply be to have us experience, you know, this chaos and this understanding that this stuff is like impermanent, and that in some sense we are part of the impermanent cycle, and that if we really look within, like especially within Hinduism, we'll find that what we truly are, our true self, is this pure consciousness, and that all this other stuff is just like sort of illusory or like surface level. It's like appearances within that consciousness. It's like, okay, and if that's the case, then you know, so much of this suffering, so much of this other stuff is just an appearance. It's an appearance that makes you question what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that in and of itself is very useful. That is very useful for not just spiritual development, but just in your life in general. Ow. But just in your life in general, when you find that... Oop, almost got me. I wonder, can they... I think I'm now out of their range. But if you find that, like, you know, that little bit of suffering can really spur you on to do a lot of other things, and a lot of investigation, and a lot of the attempts to understand why certain things are happening and why there's suffering, and, well, you know, what is the solution to suffering? Is there a way to stop suffering, or is it simply, like, you know, going to be a part of life? And, you know, the Buddhists and the Hindus, and I would even argue maybe the Christians to a certain extent, especially mystical Christians, might argue that there is actually a way to stop suffering. It's just not necessarily maybe what you would expect, and it kind of takes on different forms. And this is all part of the divine play, right? The divine play is basically that is taking place all the time. And that suffering that we take part in, it turns out, if we're very careful and very closely examine it, we can kind of see the constituent parts it's made of. We can see, like, you know, like, how does suffering function? What is the nature of, like, my own desires, and, like, where they're trying to lead me? And you can also kind of pay attention to the cycle of suffering, in the sense that you can see... What? Oh. Haha, you cannot get me. Bye-bye. Oh, bye-bye. And you can see like how that cycle works is like, okay, I want something, I get something. I want something and I don't get it. Okay, there's suffering there because I wanted something and I was clinging to the idea of getting this thing and now I don't get it. And then there's, other parts where it's like, okay, I wanted something and I got it. Well, that can only provide temporary satisfaction. And maybe in a lot of cases it can only the satisfaction it provides is very temporary and does not truly satisfy. It just gives me a brief moment of joy to be that will then go away over time, and then I'll need a new thing. And you can see this especially within our materialist societies, like how much of this stuff is just like we go after it and we cling and we desire these new things constantly, but every time we get them, they only provide a brief joy and a brief, like pleasure. And you can start asking the question, like, okay, if that's the case, is there a more permanent pleasure?
Welcome, dear customer. Yes, right this way. Right this way. Welcome, valued customer. Please, I'm hungry.
And you can also ask questions like, there, like, is the thing I'm suffering after worth it? And there are some things where you're like, well, you got to find the answer within, and you can find answers in various different philosophies, and maybe they'll give you what you're looking for. I've personally found that there's just sort of a paradox to the very nature of existence and the very nature of God, and that like the very nature of God and existence itself is contradictory in so many ways. And that I've learned that a lot of things that we desire and a lot of things that we strive after, simply put, don't give us what we want. They're just and they're often just a distraction on the road of like the spiritual seeker. And that there's also sometimes the truth is that you're just going to have to accept that there's not an answer that's satisfying to everyone, and that ultimately God knows the truth, but that does not necessarily mean that she's giving us all the truth of the matter, and that we're all, and that sometimes you gotta ask the question, would knowing the truth even satisfy me, or would it just give me a different question to seek after? And that's one of the things I think a lot of people tend to kind of forget about, which is there every question that you put a lot of time and effort into, you'll find that answers can be very nice, but a lot of times what really happens when you get answers to these questions is that you'll have new questions. And that the nature of suffering here, as Sarada Devi, explains it, and as she talks about, like, she's correct. No one is ever suffering for 100% of the time. Ow. Are you just gonna keep... Ow. Sir? I would invite you. Not constantly. And you also got to ask yourself the question of like, what answer would satisfy me? And you know, for some people, the entirety of the reason they uh, don't believe in God has to do with suffering, or like a big part of the reason is like they well, dang it. Or they like come to not understand suffering, and or they feel like suffering is something that they can't comprehend. If you know, if there's a loving God, then why would we suffer like we do? Or does the suffering, what does the suffering mean? There it is. Okay, come on. Jesus, one is a bit of pain. You are not fun to fight. But it's okay. I will give it one more try before I just run past him. Wait. And smack. You think you just because you have a cool name that you can defeat me? I mean, yes, but that's beside the point. And smack. Here we go. Yay! Anyway, yes, it's important to remember there's a lot of different answers out there, and that sometimes it's a good idea to just accept that yes, there's going to be suffering and that we can move past it. You can sit there and attempt to figure out for a billion hours why they're suffering and why they're suffering the way there is, and we all have our own little theories, but sometimes it's best to simply move on and smell the roses and remember that there's also goodness in the world. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope that you all have a wonderful day. Okay, bye-bye. Bye, love you, bye. God loves you, bye.